When Texas Ranger Frank Hamer's posse finally caught up with Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow on a rural Louisiana road in 1934, ending a manhunt that had already stretched across multiple states and drawn national newspaper coverage for months, they found an arsenal inside the couple's own death car that looked considerably more like a small military unit's own equipment than anything two Depression-era bank robbers should have realistically been able to acquire through ordinary criminal channels. 3 fully automatic rifles, a sawed-off shotgun, pistols hidden in every direction, including one taped directly to Bonnie's own thigh beneath her own clothing. That single car, parked on an otherwise unremarkable stretch of rural highway, told the story of an entire criminal era built around weapons its own designers had never actually intended for the purpose they ended up serving in the hands of America's most notorious outlaws. This is the story of 7 specific firearms that armed America's most notorious Prohibition and Depression-era gangsters, the soldiers and inventors who originally designed every single one of them for entirely different purposes, and the considerably darker second life each weapon eventually found in the hands of the outlaws, who made them famous for reasons their own original creators could never have anticipated. Every week, we take apart the story stamped on the receiver of an American firearm, the founders, the criminals, and the decisions that built a legend or lost one. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. The Thompson submachine gun, a weapon this channel has already covered in considerable detail, tops nearly every list of gangster-era firearms for good reason, a design John Thompson had originally built to clear German trenches during the First World War that instead became, once commercial demand from the military and police never fully materialized in the war's own immediate aftermath, the single most recognizable weapon of Al Capone's own Chicago operation throughout the height of Prohibition. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre in February of 1929, in which Capone's own men used Thompson submachine guns to kill 7 rival gang members inside a single Chicago garage, cemented the weapon's own criminal reputation so thoroughly that its own genuine military service, decades later during the Second World War, never fully erased the earlier association in the wider public imagination, regardless of how many actual soldiers eventually carried the same weapon into legitimate combat overseas. The Browning automatic rifle, a weapon this channel has also documented in its own right, found its way into Clyde Barrow's own hands after an accomplice stole 2 examples from a Missouri National Guard armory in 1932, and Barrow immediately recognized the weapon's genuine tactical advantages over anything else available to him at the time: its powerful .30-06 cartridge, its high rate of fire, and its quick reloading compared to the pistols and shotguns police typically carried into any confrontation with the Barrow gang. Barrow personally sawed down the barrel and gas tube to make the weapon considerably shorter and more maneuverable inside a getaway car speeding away from a robbery, nicknaming his own modified creation the scattergun, reportedly because, in his own words, when people saw him point it, they scattered immediately without waiting to see what actually happened next. 3 full automatic bars, along with roughly 100 rounds of loaded magazines, were recovered from the couple's own death car after the fatal ambush. The same weapon type this channel has already documented, earning Private Charles DeGlopper a posthumous Medal of Honor for entirely legitimate combat use just a decade later, a striking contrast in how identically the exact same weapon design could serve 2 completely opposite purposes, depending entirely on whose hands it actually ended up in. Before we get into the shotgun, Bonnie Parker sewed a secret pocket into her own boyfriend's trousers, specifically to conceal. If you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. It costs nothing and it helps the channel keep telling these stories. The Remington Model 11, a licensed American copy of John Browning's own Auto 5 shotgun design, became a favorite among Depression-era outlaws specifically because its recoil-operated action tolerated a drastically shortened barrel without sacrificing reliability, unlike many competing shotgun designs of the era that depended on a longer barrel length to function correctly at all. Gangsters cut both the barrel and the stock down dramatically, creating a compact, easily concealed weapon nicknamed the Whippet for the speed with which it could actually be drawn from concealment and brought to bear in a sudden confrontation with either police or rival criminals. Bonnie Parker herself carried a 20-gauge version, reportedly sewing a false zippered pocket directly into some of Clyde's own trousers, specifically to help conceal the weapon during their own bank robberies, a detail that speaks to just how thoroughly ordinary daily criminal logistics, rather than any dramatic shootout, actually shaped the couple's own choice of weapons day to day across their own 2-year crime spree. John Dillinger's own gang carried at least one similar whippet, chambered in 12-gauge, a weapon considerably more common among Midwestern bank robbers of the era than popular film has generally suggested to modern audiences more familiar with the Thompson's own dominant screen presence in decades of subsequent gangster cinema. The Colt M1911, a pistol this channel has already covered extensively from its own original military origins, represented the actual state-of-the-art in combat handguns throughout the entire gangster era, carried by law-abiding citizens and criminals alike in roughly equal measure, given the weapon's own widespread commercial availability at the time through entirely ordinary retail channels. Clyde Barrow personally carried an M1911 that Frank Hamer's own posse recovered from his body after the fatal ambush, a pistol Hamer reportedly kept for himself afterward as a personal memento of the manhunt's own conclusion, alongside Bonnie's own separate revolver taken from the same scene that same afternoon. That same basic pistol design this channel has already documented went on to serve American soldiers through 2 entire world wars and beyond, the exact same mechanical reliability that made it attractive to criminals, also making it, only a few years later, one of the most trusted sidearms American soldiers actually carried into combat overseas against an entirely different kind of enemy altogether. A considerably more exotic variant of that same M1911 design found its way specifically into the hands of Babyface Nelson, one of the era's most volatile and dangerous outlaws, a criminal whose own reputation for reckless violence exceeded even Dillinger's own considerable notoriety among law enforcement officials tracking the entire gang. San Antonio gunsmith Hyman Lebman converted standard M1911 pistols into fully automatic weapons, adding an extended magazine, a vertical foregrip borrowed directly from Thompson submachine gun design, and a custom muzzle brake to control the resulting recoil, creating what customers and law enforcement alike eventually nicknamed a mini machine gun, a genuinely bespoke criminal weapon built entirely outside any conventional manufacturer's own official product catalog. Nelson used one of these Lebman conversions to shoot his own way out of a federal raid at the Little Bohemia Lodge in Wisconsin in 1934, and Lebman himself later insisted, whether genuinely or simply for his own legal protection once his own client list became public knowledge, that he had believed his well-dressed, well-paying customers were wealthy oil men with a passing interest in firearms rather than some of the most wanted criminals in the entire country, a claim considerably harder to sustain once investigators discovered Lebman had reportedly shared a Thanksgiving dinner with Nelson's own family. John Dillinger's own final weapon tells a considerably quieter story than any of the automatic weapons that made his own gang famous across the Midwest. On the night FBI agents shot and killed Dillinger outside Chicago's Biograph Theater in July of 1934, betrayed to federal agents by an acquaintance who became known afterward as the Woman in Red, Dillinger was carrying nothing more dramatic than a compact Colt model 1908 pocket pistol chambered in a comparatively modest .380 caliber, a concealable sidearm intended for exactly the kind of casual evening out at a movie theater he had actually been enjoying when federal agents finally caught up with him after a manhunt that had already made his own name a household word across the entire country. Dillinger never actually drew the weapon before agents opened fire, meaning the pistol most associated with the FBI's own most famous manhunt of the entire era never actually fired a single shot in its owner's own final, fatal encounter with the law that had spent months tracking him down. The final weapon in this particular arsenal belonged to Bonnie Parker herself, a small .38 caliber Colt Detective Special revolver Texas Ranger Frank Hamer's posse found taped directly to her own thigh after the fatal ambush that finally ended the couple's own 2-year crime spree across multiple states. That specific revolver remained in the Hamer family's own possession for decades afterward, passed down as a genuine family heirloom rather than simply forgotten evidence, eventually selling at public auction in 2012 for $264,000, a price reflecting the weapon's own unmatched historical provenance, rather than anything remarkable about the revolver's own comparatively ordinary mechanical design, a small, easily concealed pistol, identical in most respects to thousands of other examples any ordinary American consumer could have purchased through entirely legal channels during the exact same period of the weapon's own original manufacture. The press coverage surrounding these 7 weapons, and the criminals who carried them, did nearly as much to shape the era's own lasting reputation as the actual violence itself. Newspapers across the country running photographs of recovered arsenals and captured weapons that fed a genuinely voracious public appetite for exactly this kind of criminal spectacle during the depths of the Great Depression, when ordinary economic hardship made outlaws robbing banks that many struggling Americans already resented feel, to at least some segments of the public, less like straightforward criminals and more like folk heroes, striking back against exactly the kind of institution many families blame for their own economic suffering. That specific cultural moment, a nation simultaneously fascinated by and increasingly determined to stop the same criminal violence dominating its own newspapers, created the precise political conditions that let the National Firearms Act actually pass through Congress with remarkably little organized opposition compared to firearms legislation debates in later decades, a piece of federal law shaped as much by the era's own newspaper coverage as by any single act of violence recorded in an actual police report. This is not a story about 7 uniquely dangerous or specially engineered criminal weapons, since every single firearm on this list was originally designed for entirely legitimate purposes: military service, law enforcement use, or ordinary civilian self-defense, before criminals simply acquired the exact same commercially available products everyone else could purchase through the same legal channels available to any ordinary American consumer at the time. It is a story about how thoroughly the absence of meaningful federal firearms regulation during the 1920s and early 1930s let a relatively small number of increasingly notorious outlaws assemble genuinely military-grade arsenals with remarkably little practical difficulty, a gap in the law the gangsters themselves inadvertently helped close through their own escalating notoriety and the mounting public outrage that notoriety eventually produced across the entire country. The specific violence these 7 weapons enabled, from the St. Valentine's Day massacre through the final ambush that killed Bonnie and Clyde, directly produced the first serious federal firearms legislation in American history, the National Firearms Act of 1934, a law this channel has already covered from the Thompson's own specific perspective, imposing a steep tax specifically targeting automatic weapons and short-barreled shotguns of exactly the kind these same outlaws had relied on so heavily throughout their own criminal careers across multiple states simultaneously. That legislation arrived only months after Bonnie and Clyde's own death and just weeks before Dillinger's own final encounter outside the Biograph Theater, a piece of federal law shaped directly and specifically by the exact criminal arsenal this list has just walked through in detail, each weapon's own criminal notoriety contributing in its own way to the eventual legal response that followed, once public patience with the entire era's own escalating violence had genuinely run out. Several of the criminals who carried these 7 weapons met considerably more violent ends than Hollywood's own later romanticized retellings sometimes suggest to modern audiences, more familiar with the film versions than the actual historical record documented in police reports and contemporary newspaper accounts from the period itself. Of the major figures associated with this particular arsenal, only Machine Gun Kelly, despite the fearsome nickname the press had actually given him, died of natural causes decades later while still serving a life sentence in federal prison, a genuinely unusual outcome compared to Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, and Babyface Nelson, all of whom died in gunfights with law enforcement within a remarkably short span of each other during the single, extraordinarily violent year of 1934 alone, a 12-month period that effectively ended the entire public enemy era of American crime almost as suddenly as it had first captured the nation's own attention only a few years earlier. The 7 weapons themselves long outlived the criminals who briefly made them famous, scattered afterward into museum collections, private holdings, and in several documented cases, direct family possession of the exact same law enforcement officers who had recovered them from crime scenes decades earlier. That afterlife, part historical artifact and part genuine collector's curiosity, means visitors to firearms museums and historical exhibits today can still view several of these exact weapons in person. Physical objects that connect a viewer directly to a specific, documented moment of American criminal history considerably more immediately than any photograph or newspaper account from the period ever managed to convey on its own. A tangible link between the ordinary commercial firearms market of the 1920s and 30s and the specific individuals who briefly turned a small handful of those ordinary products into some of the most feared criminal weapons in the entire history of American law enforcement, a reputation these same 7 designs never actually earned through any fault of their own original engineering or intended purpose. Collectors and historians studying this specific period today generally distinguish original documented examples from the countless replicas and reproduction pieces that have entered the market in the decades since, a distinction that matters enormously to genuine value given how thoroughly provenance, rather than the weapon's own mechanical condition alone, actually drives pricing for firearms, tied this closely to specific, well-documented criminal events. A weapon with a clear, verifiable chain of ownership back to an actual gangster or the law enforcement officer who recovered it commands a price multiple times higher than an otherwise identical example, lacking that same documented history, a market reality that has, over the decades, encouraged considerably more careful record-keeping around these specific 7 weapons than almost any other comparable category of American firearms history. If you want more stories about the weapons built for one purpose that found an entirely different, considerably darker one instead, subscribe, and we will keep finding them for you. See you in the next one.